Coming in at number 5, we've got Danny slash Malfeitor. Well, we'll kick it off pretty simple with a throwback to the horror movies of the 80s. Witchboard is a Ouija-themed romp through the mean streets of California, ranging from house parties to construction sites to an ever-infamous lake sequence. It's pretty cheesy, but there are definitely some good bits if you're into 80s horror. We kick off the introduction to evil presences with a good old-fashioned group session. While her boyfriend is off getting drunk, Linda gets her hands on her ex's Ouija board and summons a presence in front of a crowd, and that is not a euphemism. The partygoers meet Danny, a young boy who died a tragic death and is now communicating with everyone through the board. Things get heated between Linda's current and ex-boyfriends, which results in Danny slashing the tires of a car. Whoops. Danny's still a good kid though. The next day, Linda decides to call up Danny again and see how he's doing, but this time she brings out the board all alone without any guidance. Bad call, as the presence that shows up says he's Danny but is hiding his true identity. Always a bad sign. The presence helps Linda find her engagement ring and never gets dismissed. This means it can stick around and do what it wants, wherever it wants, whenever it wants. And what it wants is to kill any and everyone who might get in its way. See, this presence that claimed to be Danny on the second day was actually that of Carlos Malfeitor, an evil spirit. The man was an axe murderer in life, gunned down by police while trying to escape capture. As it turns out, he lived in Linda's house way back before she moved in. He'd been waiting for an opportunity to possess someone for ages, and this was the perfect time. Using progressive entrapment, he slowly but surely works towards being able to take over Linda and enter back into the living world. This results in plenty of death and destruction along the way, including almost getting her boyfriend arrested for the murders. So while you're using a Ouija board, do some research about where you're using it. If a bunch of nasty stuff occurred at your location, don't do it. Also keep an eye out for demons pretending to be other people. That one's a little harder to make sure of though. Coming in at number 4, we've got Kelly. This name doesn't sound so bad, but if you like your head to remain upon your shoulders, avoid it at all costs. Seriously though, this demon is sending out all of the warning signals possible, so if you end up dead, it really is your fault. She first showed up when a young lad was trying out Ouija with his older brother and cousin. They set up the board, got things ready to rock, and began to ask questions. With the lights out and candles lit, things were about to get spooky. And spooky things got. The young lad had a doll with him at the time, and this doll went by the name of Kelly. Uh-oh. Of course, it was good to have such a figure for comfort while doing something so potentially scary, so when the planchette started moving, he reached for his doll. However, Kelly was missing in action. Panicked, the kid looked back to the board and saw that it was spelling something. K-E-L-L-Y. Oh my goodness. Soon after, the ritual ended and the boys were considerably shaken. The youngest one looked frantically for his doll, but to no avail. However, later she was found, without her head. Someone or something had taken the doll, popped its dome off, and hidden the pieces away. If you ask me, this is a kind of warning, a sign of things to come. The next time you try to use a Ouija board around here, the demon might spell your name. And then your head might go missing. Not the kind of injury that's easy to recover from, yeah?
Next up at number 3, Odd House. This one is equal parts charming and insanely unnerving, so let me know what you think in the comments down below. Reddit user Memory Eater painted a beautiful picture of their childhood home in a time gone Ask Reddit thread from 4 years ago. As a child, they lived in a bizarre little house. It was incredibly tall and thin, full of quirks like 2 fully functioning fireplaces, a weird shower in the basement, and an old-timey rope-pulled dumbwaiter that led from the kitchen to their bedroom. The fact that it was incredibly old also meant that it was falling apart, and in short was a complete money sink, so their parents sold the house and they had to move. As Memory Eater was cleaning out their closet, they stumbled across something that they'd never noticed before. A strange attic entrance to their walk-in wardrobe. Of course, being an adventurous kid, they opened it up and headed up a strange set of steps. The first thing that they noticed was that it wasn't as dark as it should have been. The place was strung with weird red Christmas lights that seemed to have been recently lit. There was also a bed the place seemed lived in, an old gurney piled with sleeping bags and sheets, and bizarrely a small mint coloured fridge which still worked. The strangest thing though was the bones. A lot of bones, heaped in piles in the corner, small, large, clean and white, scattered throughout the small room. 2 of them had been burnt black, and scrawled on the wall was a dark coloured bone-charred message, the word sorry over and over again. Someone had been sleeping over their head for 8 years, and what the hell, this is insanity. Well, they never found out who or what it was. Swinging in at number 2, Something at Sea. Yeah, this one is pretty damn weird. True or no, I don't know, but it's creepy as hell. Again, another military story. Told you weird stuff always happens to them. This one comes from Reddit user Engerby. The story reportedly takes place roughly around a year ago while on board the USS New York, operating somewhere remotely in the Atlantic. They were staging a mock military exercise with half the crew posing as pirates and the other seizing possession of their ship. While as their squad was heading out on a small boarding vessel, things got a little bit weird and a thick fog descended on their position. It was only meant to be a short 5-minute ride to their destination, but over 10 minutes had passed at this point and they still hadn't hit. They were lost in the middle of nowhere, as if they'd fallen asleep and ended up miles completely off course. Eventually, after the engine had cut out already once before, they came across a massive old rusted ship, like a cruise liner that had been pulled from the bottom of the ocean. Of course, they boarded it, but inside they found something even stranger. They found reams and reams of books, sketches of some kind in notepads, of creatures that weren't supposed to exist. Massive marine animals, twisted squids, ungodly whales, and a note. These are what I have observed on my 14-month journey. Well, of course, they quickly got the hell out of there, and for fear of sounding insane, they refused to report it to their superior officers. Well, worse things have happened at sea, eh? And finally, at our number one spot, my favourite ever Reddit story, sticky notes. Not exactly a horror story, but so much more potentially terrifying. 3 years ago, Reddit user rbradbury1920 posted to the legal advice subreddit about a strange series of events that had recently plagued him. It first began when he found a yellow sticky note in a handwriting that wasn't his own on his desk at home, reminding him to run some personal errands, but hadn't told anybody about. Very odd, but he chalked it up to something that he'd done in his sleeping state, half awake. A few days later, he found another sticky note in the exact same handwriting, telling him to make sure he'd saved his documents. He freaked out this time, but there were no signs of a break-in and no signs of criminal intent. The next time, he found another post-it note saying, "Our landlord isn't letting me talk to you, but it's important we do." What the hell? Well, he was convinced that it was his landlord playing games with him, breaking into his apartment. He found a letter from when he first moved in, and the handwriting was seemingly identical to his landlord's. The big twist? Well, Reddit user Kakalak pretty much saved this guy's life. In the comments, after a thorough analysis of the situation, he concluded that his apartment was leaking carbon monoxide, and he was correct. Our Reddit user had been suffering from slow carbon monoxide poisoning and was experiencing hallucinations that led to him writing sticky notes to himself. If it would have continued, in all likelihood, he could have ended up dead. So, good job, Kakalak.
Number 5 on this list is a sad story of a husband and a wife. I was unable to learn their names, but for the purposes of this video, let's call them Anna and Tom. The story takes place back in 1935 when the pair were married and living in Texas. They were in their late 30s when their marriage started to crumble. Anna had really taken to the Ouija board that she had gotten and often went to it for advice and answers. She had suspected for quite a while that Tom had been cheating on her. She believed that the affair was ongoing and happening with their next door neighbor. She consulted her Ouija board and it confirmed these suspicions to her. After hearing this, she accosted her husband about this affair, which he vehemently denied. She didn't believe him though and kept consulting the Ouija board, and it kept giving her the same answer. Tom wouldn't budge though, and every time she asked him, he swore that he would never do that to her and the Ouija board was lying. After several weeks of this, Anna started to lose her mind. One day, while Tom was asleep, she took some wire and tied his limbs to the bedpost. He woke up naked and unable to move, his wife staring down at him with a makeshift whip. She proceeded to torture him with the whip, then a burning poker stick, and then with a kitchen knife. Finally, she grabbed the gun that Tom had and held it to his head. When she did this, he told her what she wanted to hear. That this entire time, the Ouija board had been right and that he was sleeping with the neighbor. Rather than kill him, Anna actually loosened the restraints and was relieved to have her suspicions proved right. Tom, fearing for his life though, lunged for the gun that she'd put on the nightstand and he shot her, killing Anna, his wife, where she stood. What makes this message so demonic is that Tom was never actually sleeping with the neighbor, or at least that's what he claims. The torture became far too much for him though, and he was willing to admit to anything just to try and stay alive. Clearly, a demon decided that Anna was in a vulnerable place, and this would be the perfect time to not only ruin her marriage, but also her life. Number 4 on this list is Angelah Jackson. Angelah was a young girl in her 20s from Australia. She became obsessed with the Ouija board to communicate with her father who had passed away roughly 2 years ago. She was very close with her dad, and letting him go was super hard for her. Whenever she would contact him, they would have a good conversation through the board. However, her father always made it clear that this has to be the last time that she uses this board. He implored her to stop contacting him. This wasn't because he didn't want to talk to her, but simply his spirit recognized the dangers of this tool, and there may be a time where it isn't him that she connects with. Angelah heard his warning but proceeded to use it anyways. Whenever she was lonely, or something big happened in her life, or she just missed her father, she would pull it out. One day, Angelah felt the urge to contact her father, and she did exactly that. She pulled out the board as she normally would. She asked some questions, except this time, it wasn't her father on the other side. The room felt cold, and the light seemed as if it was being sucked away by the shadows. The demon on the other side, it was not kind, and made its intentions known, spelling out the words, "Kill yourself." Angelah wholeheartedly refused to do so after multiple requests, so finally the demon spelled out, "I will then." Petrified at this point, she threw the Ouija board in her closet and refused to touch it. She didn't want to fully throw it away though, because if she did, that would be ultimately admitting that her father's gone. She did eventually change her mind though and get rid of it about a week later, but it took a near-death experience for her to do this. She was attacked late at night by what looked to be a crazy man with an axe. He almost killed her, but she managed to get away with her life. Convinced that this was the work of the demon that she must have contacted, she threw the Ouija board away, and she never looked back.
Next up at number 3, not my boyfriend. Now, this one creeped me out a little bit, so let's hope we never run into this person. Reddit user HeartX3 Jess lived with her boyfriend in their swanky downtown apartment. She worked from home, and her boyfriend was a teacher in a town about 15 minutes away by train. He got home pretty much the exact same time every single day. Pay attention to that detail because it's important. Well, Jess and her boyfriend had been in a pretty big fight. The kind of fight where you don't even speak to each other, call, or text. At this particular juncture, Jess was lying on her bed, roughly the time that her boyfriend was due home, and she was ready to make amends. She was preparing herself for that awkward, "Hey, shall we stop fighting" kind of smile. She had earplugs in, but she could hear his heavy footsteps walking around the apartment, waiting for him to finally head to the bedroom. The door opened slowly, just a few inches. She turned her head towards the door, but it stayed still this time. Jess could see a reflection on the doorknob. It wasn't her boyfriend's hand, but a woman's hand with dark red nail polish. Whoever it was, they slowly closed the door just as they had opened it. As you would, she freaked out and hid on the balcony as she frantically called her boyfriend. Was it his mum or sister who came to visit? No, they didn't have keys. The landlady? No, she always lets them know a day in advance. Nevertheless, her boyfriend said, "Don't move, I'm calling the police." The mystery remained unsolved, not a person in sight, but the next day, when the landlady was changing the locks, they found a strange, square area by the keyhole that had been scratched away by something. Tools. Someone had forced their way inside. Spooky, eh? Coming in at number 2, Gilbert, Arizona. This one is definitely a doozy, so strap on in. It's the late 90s, and Reddit user Can610, who was 14 at the time, moved from Phoenix to Gilbert, Arizona, which at the time was just beginning to develop from a town into a bigger city. Previously, most of the land around Gilbert had been rich, well-used farmland, and it had a long line of rural history. Now, Can610 was the oldest of 7 kids, and although their house was always bustling with noise and activity, the family quickly noticed that there were a number of strange noises that would occur. The house was brand new, mind, and the land around it nothing but cornfields. One night she was having some friends over for a slumber party. As is custom at these kind of events, the talk quickly turned to ghost stories. The Hookman, rat-a-tat. They laughed at how lame they were until they heard a strange shuffling outside their room. Someone dared her to take a look. Who knows, perhaps maybe it's a ghost. So feeling brave, she did and quietly crept down the hallway. As she got to the end of the house, she noticed that the back door was actually wide open. Strange, everyone in the house was asleep. Stranger still, someone had tracked mud all over the floor. The footsteps didn't seem to move in a straight line either. They had a strange property about them. It was a thick, consistent layer of mud, almost too perfect to be an actual footprint. She screamed screamed and the slumber party ran down the hallway to her. As they huddled together, they all saw the exact same thing. Standing just beside the TV was a small boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. He wore nothing but plain denim overalls and was filthy, covered in mud. For a moment he looked at the girls with a sad, somber look, and then just like that, he was gone. The next morning, the mud had completely disappeared except for 2 dirty footprints by the back door and a dried mud mark on the outside doorknob. Maybe he left, or maybe he was always there. And finally, at our number 1 spot, Goatman while camping. Now, if you are aware of the legend of the Anansi Goatman, then you'll easily be able to fill in some of these gaps in this story because there's a lot left to the imagination. It's 2007, and Reddit user Coyotes was out with a couple of friends camping in the woods, 13 of them. Kids between the ages of 16 and 18 just wanted to have a few beers at the weekend in relative peace and feel like adults. They'd planned to stay for 4 to 5 days over the summer vacation, but little did they know what would transpire. On the first night around 7 PM, they heard something or someone moving in the bushes. They threw an empty beer bottle, heard it smashed, and slowly watched something or someone climb out of the bushes and lumber back into the trees. That'd be the first warning for me to get out. Later that night, as they slept in their tents, they heard a strange popping sound coming from the fire. They shot up out of bed to find the fire that was previously just dying coals, roaring with flames as if someone had poured gasoline on it. Well, obviously no one had. It was then that they began to smell a scent like no other. At first they thought it was a skunk, but then they realized it was more like the smell of rotten meat. Then they heard a soft voice coming from the line of trees. The group stopped. One of them, named Ben, cried out, "Oi, who's there?" Silence. And then, in a similar but eerily not quite right imitation, the sound of a reply. "Oi, who's there?" And then a figure emerged, maybe 40 or so feet away. "Oi, who's there?" it said again. The group stood transfixed. It was only then that they noticed a figure looked eerily familiar. It was the double of their friend Ben that had shouted out into the woods, in every likeness, except that it wasn't him. It stared at them for what seemed like hours, even as they hurriedly packed away their camp into their cars. Every now and then, it would cry, "Oi, who's there?" Kicking off at number 5, the recurring dream. And this story from Reddit user Just Another Gamer is a visceral and horrifying reminder that lingering in the deep recesses of the human mind are some truly perplexing chemical reactions that we can't even begin to comprehend. Have you ever had a recurring dream? Ever thought, what the hell is this all about? What does it mean? Wow, yeah, this person is still asking the same question. As the story goes, Just Another Gamer is an avid cave diver, and since about the age of 6, they explored the unknown caverns across Florida. When they were around 7 or 8 years old, they started to have a strange recurring dream. In the dream, they were exploring a cave and made their way through a little hole in the bottom. Inside was a 10 to 15 foot long corridor a few feet in height and a bent red stop sign at the end, like someone had ripped it off and tossed it inside. As they'd make their way through the corridor, it started descending, quickly opening into a large vertical chamber with a path leading down in a corkscrew pattern. Then things would get blurry, but they'd remember the image of trash scattered around the walls, things writhing in the distance, strange things, animals and corpses maybe. Amidst them, they'd see their own family, each one of them being tortured and killed, but in the dream, all they could do was scream. Our narrator had this dream for years and years, always the same thing, until 7 or 8 years later, when they were around 15, they went on a caving trip with their father, a place called Dog Drop out in the Tampa Bay area. While when they were descending on a 30-foot rappel, they felt a strange, familiar feeling. When they reached the bottom and looked up, they saw the exact same corridor from their dream. The same strange clutters of trash against the wall, the same red stop sign. Instantly, they were hit with this overwhelming sense of nausea and primal fear, and they froze. All they could do is scream to leave, and eventually their father paid attention to them and packed up their things to leave. Whatever was lurking down there, our narrator knew that it wasn't good. They'd seen it before, deep in the recesses of their own memory, and thankfully they never found out. Coming in at number 4, the boat mechanic. And this short and sweet story comes from 2 Otters in a Coat, which is a fantastic name, may I add, telling the real life tale about a guy that they knew who made their living working as a boat mechanic. Now, random acts of violence are a different kind of fear, but this one takes it to a whole new level. As the story goes, one Saturday their friend, the boat mechanic, was working alone in their workshop making some final repairs to a boat that had been brought in. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the mechanic wakes up and he's on the ground. Now, he knew that there was water beneath him just before he's working on a boat, so he assumed that he'd been electrocuted and the shock had knocked him away unconsciously. The strangest part is that he could vaguely sense someone behind him, so he started yelling for help, letting them know that he'd been electrocuted. Whoever was behind him turned and left without a word. He keeps screaming for help until eventually a neighbouring business heard his pleas and came to his aid. Later on though, once he'd been seen by the nearby hospital, he discovered from the police that he wasn't electrocuted at all. According to the police, someone had entered his workshop while he was working and hit him on the back of the head with a mallet from his own toolbox. And nothing was stolen from the shop. Now, this person was never caught and CCTV wasn't clear enough to identify the perp, but as it seems they were walking by and spontaneously decided to knock him out, potentially with the intention of killing him, for seemingly no reason whatsoever. Now that's terrifying.
Coming in at number 3, we've got a scorched corpse. Could be Freddy Krueger, could be someone else. I'd rather not take that risk though. It seems that whenever kids spend the night somewhere unfamiliar, they witness unexplainable phenomena. The result of overactive imaginations perhaps? Or is there something to these visions of the paranormal? Well, you could ask those who decided that a sleepover in an old school gym was a good idea what they saw. Christy and her soccer team had set up for an overnight stay at the school gym. Sleeping bags, snacks, scary stories, you name it. But someone brought a Ouija board, and that could not be resisted. The teammates gathered together and started the ritual, seeing if anyone from the school's history would show up. When they finally made contact with somebody, it spelled out words like thirst, and fire, and help. Then the spirit moved the planchette to goodbye, and that was that. They asked around the next day and discovered something disturbing. Apparently there had been a fire at this very location a long time ago, burning the building to the ground. Could it be that a poor, unfortunate soul was trapped in this inferno and now haunts the rebuilt gym? Coming in at number 2, we've got some solo advice. I'll do one more advice column contribution to this Ouija video just to make sure any curious individuals go in knowing as much as they possibly can. Never use a board on your lonesome. Not only is that a goofy, dorky thing to do, it can also be very dangerous. It takes 2 to tango, and it also takes a duo to draw upon the spirit world. Don't underestimate the power of the paranormal. In many dramatic interpretations of Ouija use, folks who go about it alone end up way worse for wear. Often they'll end up summoning something that will attempt to possess them, emboldened because they're alone. Or sometimes they'll simply be unable to control any aspect of the ritual and see some things that are quite upsetting. One story comes from an individual named Sarah who decided she wanted to contact some spirits in her free time. Unable, or maybe unwilling to gather some friends in time, she sat down with the board and planchette all alone. This proved to be a very bad call almost immediately as the planchette shot out of her hands and across the room. Needless to say, she did not attempt this again. Another tale comes from Oceana, who similarly wanted to see what spirits were around but refused to gather a group. When she started the ritual, nothing seemed to happen. A little perplexed, she began to clean up, but as she was moving candles, she noticed something quite spooky indeed. The planchette was moving totally on its own with Oceana nowhere near the board. She rushed over and moved it to goodbye and hasn't attempted a seance since. And finally at number 1, we've got summoning sleep paralysis. Most folks looking to dabble in Ouija will find a board and use it somewhere they feel safe, at home or maybe a friend's place. But if you're serious about finding some paranormal activity, notably haunted areas are the place to be. In visiting these locations, you're essentially accepting responsibility for whatever spirits or demons you encounter though. Take Aaron and Arjun, 2 friends who found a Ouija board and decided to take it to a graveyard. Definitely a place known for harboring spirits and the like. At the graveyard, the duo attempted to summon something and failed, or so they thought. After their uneventful seance, they returned home and went to bed. Late that night, Aaron experienced sleep paralysis for the very first time. Unable to move, he saw a ghostly woman with long black hair slowly floating towards him. Some might chalk that up to a coincidence, or maybe the fact that Aaron was a little spooked from his late night excursion. However, Arjun called up Aaron the next day and told him about an identical experience. The 2 friends had somehow summoned a spirit that followed them both home and began invading their sleep. Goodness gracious. Whether you're using satanic toothpaste or attempting to communicate with presences beyond our immediate understanding, there's a lot of risk when you dabble in the paranormal. Be careful while investigating things yourself and do your best to research before you go. Otherwise, you could end up with a sleep paralysis demon or a hex upon you and your family.
Kicking off at number 5, we've got the Lost Military Exercise. A lot of unexplainable stuff seems to happen to those in the military. Whether it's genuinely paranormal or just a mix of fear and adrenaline, we'll never really know, but this story is a little different. From Reddit user I Love Pink Nips. Back when he was back in the army, his squad ran into something pretty unexplainable during a regular navigation exercise. It was a standard drill, they were given a map and some coordinates, and they had to find certain checkpoints along the way using only a compass and a GPS backup in case of emergency. Everything was going swimmingly, but as they were nearing the end of the exercise, a squad had fallen hopelessly behind and were finally making their way to the last checkpoint. Our narrator was in charge of the last checkpoint and knew that the squad was close by in at least a 1 kilometer radius, but they couldn't yet see them due to the dense foliage. Well, he waited there for over 2 hours, still no sign. He radioed them, no response. Half an hour later, they frantically radioed back. They were lost, walking around in circles, seeing the exact same landmarks. They reported that it was pitch black, but our narrator could see that it was still light out. It was barely 6 PM and the sun was only starting to set. Well, they emergency buzzed their coordinates and they headed to their exact location, but there was no one there, nothing. The forest was eerily quiet, no birds, no insects, just dead silence. It turned out that the squadron didn't actually emerge until several hours later. They reported that they felt like they were being followed the whole time. They kept leaving knife marks on nearby trees to guide their way, but every time they came back, the mark had disappeared. Spooky, eh? Coming in at number 4, Nick at Night. We all remember Nick at Night, right? Late night cartoons that were pure amazing. While Reddit user Saint Sparkles had some pretty awesome parents who let them sleep in the living room on weekend nights, chill out on the couch and watch Nick at Night until they fell asleep. So one night during this most joyous of weekend treats, Saint Sparkles woke up on the sofa with a strange prickly feeling. It was like an instinct, something tugging at their sleeve saying, "Wake up, something's not quite right." Well, they bolted upright in a sitting position and their eyes quickly fixed on the front window. You see, our narrator lived in rural Georgia and there was a hell of a lot of trees surrounding their property. In the perfect light cast from the moon, they could see a strange silhouette, or a person, perhaps a creature, something standing in the tree outside their home. Their dog seemed to sense it too and quickly dashed to the window, snarling at the glass. Long story short, their parents heard the commotion, Dad flipped out and grabbed a gun, headed out into the forest screaming, "Get off my property." He found no one though, and Saint Sparkles quickly went back to their bedroom to sleep. Just as they were dozing off though, their gaze cast out of their bedroom window. The figure, it's there again, this time standing in a tree closer to the house. Whatever it was, he put a finger over his mouth and shushed, and then just like that, turned away and ran. Yikes.
Coming in at number 3, we've got Pus Brain. Not 2 words you really want to see together, right? Well, just listen to this story from user Slappy McSlappenstein. It speaks for itself. When I worked in healthcare, I had a patient who got a sinus infection. He stopped taking his antibiotics after a few days because he felt better. His sinus infection came back with a vengeance. When he got to the emergency department, he was presenting with stroke symptoms. The infection had spread to his cranial cavity. There was so much pus that it was twisting his brain. No one thought he would survive the surgery. The family was advised to expect the worst, but amazingly he actually survived. He ended up needing 3 more surgeries to wash out and spent almost 2 months in the hospital. So take your full dose of antibiotics, people. How are we feeling about this one? A little headache? Checking in on your sinus health? Because that is absolutely bonkers. This dude essentially had to have a brain enema because of the filth built up in his dome. That stuff comes back with a vengeance, like he said, if you're not careful. So listen to your local healthcare worker and finish your antibiotics regimen. Coming in at number 2, we've got the suffocation station. In a lot of creepypasta stories, folks who are left near some dangerous chemical or enclosed space often go mad. You know, self-mutilation, murder, hideous mutations, the works. In this story though, the folks put in an unsafe situation don't end up doing a whole lot of that. They just die, and they die quick. We live in a cruel world, and if the folks running companies aren't careful or tend to cut corners, a lot of bad stuff can happen. Take it from Reddit user Animator Spaminator. I heard this from my grandpa. He used to work in the oil/gas industry. His father actually owned the company. Anyways, they had these huge tanks full of some deadly gas that's heavier than oxygen. Some guy went down to measure the size of the tank, suffocated, and died. Another guy found him at the bottom, wanted to help him, and he went down after him, suffocated, died after falling off the ladder down. Third guy does the same. Eventually, my grandpa finds 3 dead bodies at the bottom of a large tank, all having suffocated on this toxic gas. They have vents in these tanks now, which is good. Yeah, the poor grandpa. Imagine strolling into work and discovering not 1, not 2, but 3 dead bodies. All because of an invisible assailant that robbed the oxygen from their lungs. And finally at number 1, we've got the Outback Backpack Killer. If I was ever to visit Australia, I would be on the lookout for killer animals, bugs, and temperatures. In fact, killer people probably wouldn't even cross my mind. However, as this story shows us, murderous lunatics can be anywhere at any time. User Passometer has this story to tell. I met a guy who had been traveling Australia with a couple friends, hitchhiking around as many of us have done. One of his friends told him that they were near his distant uncle's house, whom he'd never met before. He got a phone number from a family member, and as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in town and drove them out to his rural property way out in the bush. They said he seemed like a pretty normal guy, friendly and cheery. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet that was totally full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. They didn't think much of it at the time and all grabbed the kit and set up on the living room floor. They stayed a couple days and nothing out of the ordinary happened, but afterwards the uncle drove them to the bus station and they continued on their way. About a year later, the man was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He was the man who was picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and slaughtering them. The guy who told me this story was 100% certain he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of his victims. And now this guy has to walk around for the rest of his life with the knowledge that he slept in a death sleeping bag. Definitely the kind of story that ends up as the central focus of a true crime podcast.
Well, at number 5, we have the story of the gas man. Reddit user Ligamentary tells a tale from the 1960s where her and her older sister were home alone for the weekend. It was a different time where people were generally less security conscious. She was waiting for a friend to pick her up when there was a slight knock on the door. Thinking that it was her friend, she answered without checking the peephole. It was a man standing there claiming that he was the gas man and he needed to check their meter. Disappointed that it wasn't her friend, she allowed the man in. She didn't notice this at the time, but the man wasn't dressed as a city official would, but he had a green and purple striped shirt on, like the host of Blue's Clues. Immediately, the man headed upstairs to the girls' bedrooms, just as her older sister passed him on the landing. "Why is that man going upstairs?" her sister asked. She replied that he was just reading the gas meters. Her sister turned pale. "Our gas meters are outside." Ever resourceful, her old sister had a stroke of genius and a man was passing outside the house when she yelled, "Oh Dad, it's good that you're home. There's a man here to read the gas meters upstairs." Just like that, the man in the striped shirt bolted out of the house. Close call? Well, you bet, because just 3 months later, a girl went missing under the exact same circumstances. She was home alone with no signs of forced entry. They later found the girl's body. She'd been held captive for a few days and then burned alive. Coming in at number 4, The Drums of War Woman Dal. Now, this one is a little short but sweet and completely terrifying if you have a morbid fear of the unknown. Reddit user Cough Cakes, great name, shared this unnerving tale to strike fear into the heart of campers everywhere. It was the year 2000 and he had spent a year at Aspen Youth Alternatives, a wilderness survival camp that taught young people the importance of independent survival and self-reliance. During one of their more remote hikes, they ventured off trail and made camp near a place called War Woman Dal. It was a beautiful location, but many of the campers said it just felt a little bit off. There was a strange silence in the air that didn't quite make sense, and an absence of something that they couldn't quite put their finger on. There were 15 campers sleeping in groups of 3 and 2 staff members that took turns on a night shift, keeping up an eye in the woods. Gradually, he started to hear a faint rhythm in the distance, slowly getting louder and louder. Thinking that it was all in his head, he asked the girl next to him if she could hear it too. At first she said no, but then it got louder and closer and she could definitely hear the drums. Thinking it was the kids, a staff member hollered at them to knock it off. It was time to get to sleep, but the drums just kept getting louder. By this time, the whole group were out of their tents, looking at each other, staring off in bewilderment. A few of the campers were stood still, tears streaming down their faces. The drums lasted until daybreak. Needless to say, the group quickly left the trail. Smart move, thankfully.
Number 3 on this list is a story from a man named Steve. Now, Steve's story already starts out poor because the Ouija board that he ends up using is one that he and his friends found in a dumpster. Once they pulled it out of there, this board started working for them almost immediately. The one problem is that it was in Latin, and only one of the people there could understand what it was saying. It apparently wasn't saying anything menacing off of the top, just kind of weird and creepy things. Steve didn't like this thing at all, and he was definitely spooked, but curiosity got the better of him. He didn't truly believe that a spirit was guiding his hand and wanted to understand the logic of how it was happening. As you're all expecting, this was a poor choice by Steve, and he inevitably had to pay for it. Steve went to sleep that night at a little bit past midnight. When he woke up, it was 3 a.m. in the morning, and he was standing straight up, playing with what looked to be a drawn-on Ouija board on the wall. He couldn't control his movements. He was just watching as his body mindlessly moved around the Ouija board, spelling things out. The first thing that he saw his hand spell out was, "Why are you hurting me?" Then the next thing was, "I need your spirit." Steve was locked in to this frozen state, but he still had his mind. He says that it took every ounce of mental energy he could muster to try and break out of what felt like this demonic Ouija curse and regain control of his movements. He fell to the ground in a deep sweat, staring at what he had done in complete shock and awe. The Ouija board was dealt with right away, and it wasn't long after that Steve sold his place and moved to a completely different city. Number 2 on this list is from a woman named Tanny. A few years ago, Tanny lived in Chicago with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend, who is now her ex, had just lost a very close friend and was going through a rough time. Trying to be a supportive girlfriend and help him get through it, she thought that maybe getting a Ouija board would be a good idea. Her initial thought was to help him get a little bit of closure on the whole experience and maybe to speak to his friend one last time. Obviously, as it often happens with these boards, that isn't how the whole scenario went down. The couple set up the board in their living room and started using it like one typically would. At first they weren't feeling anything at all and just thought that this was standard. But then a chill filled the air. Both Tanny and her boyfriend felt an enormous weight hit their bodies and a deep sense of depression. This came along with a horrible sense of foreboding that something awful was about to happen. This was very strange because the board itself, it wasn't actually giving them any strange answers to the questions. That part felt as if everything was normal. Even though this strange feeling about something to come scared the pair, they kept playing with the board. It didn't take long after that for both of them to stop though. In the corner of their living room appeared a black, fleshy humanoid creature that looked as if it was one with the shadows. Tanny saw this and screamed at the top of her lungs, but when her boyfriend looked, it was completely gone. She swore that she saw something and refused to play anymore, demanding that they go to bed. It took her a very long time to fall asleep after that, but eventually she did, and that's where the message came. Dipping into this deep dream, Tanny vividly remembers how real it all felt. She claims that she has never felt a dream that seemed so close to reality like the one that she had that night. She materialized in a forest, and standing in front of her was the dark demon being that she saw in the corner of her living room earlier that night. Her heart raced, and she tried to run, but her feet were stapled to the ground. The demon glided its way closer to her, and when it was only a few feet away, said, "Your first child will suffer like his friend." Then it took its black, fleshy hand and shoved it into her stomach, stabbing her with its long fingernails. She woke immediately, feeling as if she just got stabbed and punched in the stomach all at once. She hasn't tried to have children since then, but she doesn't believe that she ever will. She is convinced that the demon was referring to her boyfriend's friend, in which case her first child would die. Something that she doesn't believe she could ever cope with. Number 1 on this list comes from a Reddit user named Jake Nichols. Jake recounts the story of how he and his cousin used a Ouija board one evening and immediately regretted it. The first thing to note about this story is that the Ouija board was found in the attic of their home when they were cleaning it out. It was an older board and looked as if it had been up there for years. Whilst they were cleaning out the attic though, they removed a few other items from there, old clothes, some furniture, other small knickknacks as well. Anyways, they opened up of this Ouija board and set it down on the ground of their home to test it out. They started messing around with it and were having a pretty good time until they started to notice a pattern. It seemed as if it would only accurately respond to Jake. To test the theory, Jake asked it a question only he could possibly know the answer to. What is my social security number? The board moved from one number to the next, to the one following that. It did this 9 times to produce what was Jake's exact 9-digit social security number. Absolutely shocked, Jake and his cousin asked the spirit to show itself. Bad move though. This board slowly picked the letters D-O-L-L. Doll. Now doll, what does that mean? We asked you to show yourself and you wrote doll. And then Jake remembered. While they were cleaning out the attic, one of the knickknacks he removed was this very old doll of a girl with red hair in a little brown dress. This doll had been sitting on top of the Ouija board when they went up there. The boys rushed in the room where they put all of the knickknacks, and when they got there, standing up on its own 2 legs was that very same doll with a sick, sadistic smile across its face. Its eyes looked alive and pierced directly into Jake's soul. Then, defying all logic, the doll's mouth moved and sounds came out. You woke me up, Jake. I was sleeping. Jake and his cousin's heart were pounding quicker than they have ever felt in their lives. The doll made one final drilling stare, and then it fell to the ground, lifeless, as if it had been there the whole time. Jake and his cousin immediately took the Ouija board and the doll and burned them outside. They both stayed in another home that night as well, fearing that whatever they released may still be on the hunt.
Coming in at number 5, the Undead Witch. Generally speaking, you should avoid undead witches. The living ones can be reasoned with and are often quite pleasant to converse with, even if you yourself are not a follower of Wicca. The ones who perished and through some dark magic managed to make it back to the realm of the living, those are the ones you gotta watch out for. Nobody wants to be at the receiving end of a hex or spell cast by a practitioner of magic who has returned from the grave. No thank you. An unfortunate cohort of Ouija-using pals accidentally summoned one though, and the results were less than pretty. After procuring a Ouija board through some pretty standard methods, a guy named Justin and his pals decided to have a little seance, all in good fun of course. Fun is just how those things start though, and it quickly took a turn for the worse. The friends opened up the session and began to ask questions of the presence they had summoned. At first there was no response, but the intrepid paranormal enthusiasts pressed on dauntless, looking for some sort of message from the other side. Then the planchette started moving. Slowly at first, it swayed back and forth between the 4 corners of the board, picking up speed as it went. Soon it was just doing quick laps around the board. The circle shifted and undulated as the planchette began drawing out new shapes on the surface, freaking everyone out. They called it off, closed the circle, and decided to do something else. However, when Justin tried the board again, this time with a different friend, the results were the same, a slowly shifting planchette eventually reaching a fever pitch. After that second experience, he started to notice strange things happening. He would wake up in the middle of the night with the sensation of someone grabbing his arm. His pals that participated in the paranormal practice reported similar events. Looking into it, they discovered that this experience could have endowed them with a hex. From beyond the grave, this witch decided to weave some spells and made some mischief. Hopefully the folks on the receiving end are okay now. Coming in at number 4, close the circle. Now, this is just good advice for anyone interested in Ouija. Make sure that you fully understand the ritual before going in and performing it. Walking in half prepared will always end in disaster, so do not wing it. Read up on the process, ensure you understand what must be done, and for goodness sakes, make sure to close the ritual at the end. You can do everything else right, from starting with a good mindset, to being polite and patient with your summoned spirit, to refraining from asking for physical signs that they are present. But if you don't move the planchette to goodbye at the end of the session, whatever presence you've brought into your home is liable to stick around and experience most foul. Some will be friendly, amicable spirits from the great beyond, willing to interact and leave without any trouble. But you can't believe everything a spirit tells you on a Ouija board, and many times demons will appear under the guise of a good-natured individual. This is where things can get dangerous. Take poor Vince, who once used a Ouija board as a child. He and his brothers managed to summon a Russian spirit who claimed to have been murdered in cold blood. A classic origin story for sure. But after they stopped communicating, the brothers decided to go get some food. food without closing the circle. When they returned to the basement, the energy had noticeably shifted. A dark, heavy presence was here, and things were not as they were. Books and toys had been flung around the room in a whirlwind, but the Ouija board still sat in the middle, undisturbed. Apparently, when Vince looked into the mirror in the basement, he noticed that the eye on the Ouija board was looking around the room as if searching for something. The brothers moved the planchette to goodbye and resolved never to do that again.
Next up at number 3, the closet. This story comes from Tighty Whitey's 37, which is, yeah. As the story goes, back in 2002 they were living in an old apartment that had been built back in the year 1900, making it just over 100 years old when they moved in. Now everything in the apartment was great apart from one thing. The bedroom, and in particular the closet in the bedroom, which gave them the unnerving feeling that someone or something was watching them when it was left ajar. So much so that when this particular Reddit user was sleeping, they'd often hear strange gasping noises, and it would seem that they were coming from within the closet. They'd check, nothing there. But for that reason, the closet would always stay closed. A month or so of them staying in the apartment, there was a loud bang on the closet door one night, and our narrator was woken from their sleep. It was pitch black, yet they sensed something that emerged from the closet, standing over them, a pressure holding them down in their bed. And yeah, you could explain this away with sleep paralysis, but the end of this story may just make you think twice. Throughout their stay at the apartment, the encroaching sense of dread from the closet had never quite left, and even their friends would comment on the strange feeling that they felt when in the vicinity of the closet. It got so bad that eventually they had the chance to move to another unit, so they jumped at the opportunity, packed their stuff up, and got the hell out of there. Well, a few years later, the owners were renovating the building when our narrator was walking past the doorway of their old apartment. Curiously, they caught the building manager who was painting in the bedroom and began talking about the strange feeling that they felt whilst living there. Without thinking twice, the building owner explained that the former tenant of the apartment had committed suicide. They'd hanged themselves in the closet. And not only that, but the original designer of the building, who had also stayed in the same apartment, had also committed suicide. They'd hanged themselves in the exact same closet. Swinging in at number 2, the baby upstairs. And this story comes from Reddit user UrgeHouse666, spooky name bud, who explains an incredibly strange moment during their teenage years. As the tale goes, when they were in high school, their uncle would throw them a couple of bucks every now and then to babysit his kids with their aunt. They lived in a beautiful old 2-story house by the water in a nice area, and the 2 children were around 3 and 6. One day our narrator was sitting in the den scrolling through their phone when they started to hear a baby crying. Of course, it must be the 3-year-old distressed upstairs, so doing their babysitting duty, they headed to check on them. They called out a couple of times while heading upstairs, to no response. They called for their aunt to see if she was dealing with it. No response again. When they turned to start walking up the stairs, they caught a glimpse outside in the yard. It was their aunt with her 2 children laughing and playing on the grass. They heard the babies cry again, the noise coming from upstairs, and all of the hairs on our narrator's body stood on end, a chill running down their spine. Quietly, they turned around, walked down the stairs, got in their car and drove away. The baby was still crying when they closed the door behind them. A few years later, our narrator was drunk at a family party, and they mustered the courage to tell their uncle the story. He said that him and his wife used to hear the baby too, crying when no one else was around. According to him, the previous owners had a small child that had died of cot death in the same room that the cries were coming from. Spooky stuff. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the attic. And again, another tale of spooky kids in upstairs locations. Sorry, I hope that wasn't a spoiler. This story comes from Reddit user Ghouls, who tells the tale of the time that they'd moved into their new childhood home. You see, their family had managed to snag a deal because previously the house was used as a model home to show off the housing design of the surrounding area. Upstairs, it had this loft area that had 2 stairwells that attached to it on either end, one in the front and one in the back. You could pretty much hear everything from up there as it was so open. Anyway, one day our narrator and their 2 friends, a guy and a girl, were hanging out in the loft. It was high school, so teenagers being teenagers, the pair were pretty handsy. They were watching TV all snuggled together on the sofa when our narrator got up to take a leak. When they got back, the 2 of them were on completely different ends of the couch, their faces drained of all colour. Our narrator asked them what was up, and the guy said, "Your little sister is home." Instantly our narrator's face went white as a sheet. "What's wrong?" the girl asked. You see, our narrator didn't have a little sister, and he asked them what made them think he did. They replied that they'd heard her and then they'd seen her, but for all they knew, no one was in the house. To this day, our narrator's two best friends swear that they heard a little girl laugh and run up the stairs, hitting her hand on each step like she was running up on all fours, like kids do. As it turned out, before it was a model home, a family had lived there and their young daughter had been playing upstairs in the loft. She'd climbed a railing, slipped and fell to her death, and no one thought to mention that fact when they were flipping the house. No wonder they got such a good deal.
Coming in at number 5, bug-eyed. We love a good pun from time to time, but this one might just stick with me for the rest of my life. As a person who's worked at swimming pools and summer camps, I've seen all sorts of different stuff get into people's eyes, from sticks, rocks, chlorinated water, bird droppings, and of course, bugs. Hell, I had a gnat fly into my eye while I was biking just last week. But these are all things that can be removed relatively easily if you're careful. They're not trying to make a home in your ocular orb. This story from Reddit user Oscar Devine makes me want to scream, and you're about to find out why. It goes like this. I've told this story before. I'm an eye doctor and I had a patient come to me with an infected eyelid 2 other eye doctors tried to treat and failed. They were dumping all sorts of medicine into it and it wasn't getting any better. At this point it was swollen and painful for weeks with no improvement despite being on tons of meds. Apparently neither of them thought to flip the lid upside down, you know, the gross trick that some kids do with their upper eyelids. It was a painful maneuver for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain it. Anyhow, there appeared to be what looked like a visible abscess inside the tissue with thick, gooey material. I thought I'd give it a nudge and I saw it move. This wasn't an abscess, it was something else. I managed to remove it quite easily in one whole piece. It was a fly larva. The patient told me that she had a bug hit her in the eye a few days before she got this infection. I removed the larva and within 2 days the wound closed and she was 100% recovered on basic antibiotic eye drops. Yes, I do have the photos for this case for those interested. I mean, I for one am not interested. Walking around with a larva in your eyelid for weeks and not bothering to figure out what it actually was? What if it was like wriggling around in there? What if it decided to start crawling around and looking for food? This is the kind of body horror I would expect in a movie, not real life. Although, what is real life if not horror? Let's keep moving. Coming in at number 4, we've got some unwelcome tenants. This is a personal fear of mine played out right before someone's very eyes. The idea of a silent, sneaky, and altogether uninvited individual deciding that the nooks and crannies of my home are free real estate just drives me nuts. And the worst bit is you're living in blissful ignorance of this until something finally sticks out and other patterns reveal themselves. Those bumps in the night? That wasn't the house settling or whatever other explanation your grandmother might have given you. That was a squatter moving around in the dark. All that food seemingly going missing. It sure wasn't partially forgotten midnight snacks or your friends being greedy, if you know what I'm saying. Those times the motion sensing lights went off in the middle of the night. Not mice, raccoons, or squirrels. Boy, oh boy. User IEAMS85 told their tale in a thread about this particular occurrence. For about a year I lived in a house with 4 housemates. We had a pretty big backyard with a garage and a tool shed that we never used, ever. We also had motion detector lights. 2 of my housemates were very superstitious and believed in ghosts and spirits and such. They also liked to get high on different substances. The lights in our backyard would go off randomly. I assumed it was animals, my housemates were sure it was a ghost. One of them told us she'd seen a man ghost looking through our window when she was high on shrooms. They thought it was scary, I thought nothing of it because, well, yeah. A few nights later, drunk me thought I saw a man through the mesh door to the backyard. I just thought my mind was playing tricks on me because my housemates kept talking about the ghost. Eventually I moved out to go back to my home country, and about 6 months after that I FaceTimed with one of the housemates. Turns out we hadn't seen a ghost. A homeless man had been living in our tool shed for God knows how long. Gave me the creeps for sure. All this happening pre-pandemic is horrific, right? But imagine it happening now. You're always home, and they have smaller windows to get out of their hiding spot. What if somebody died while in your home because they couldn't get enough food or couldn't get outside and you didn't even know until you smelled something funny? That's not an experience I ever want to have. Coming in at number 3, we've got Doris. Back to some movie magic for a moment. Doris is the exceptionally upsetting demon featured in Blumhouse's Ouija series. She turned out to be the main villain in the first one, and then the prequel explores her tragic backstory. Demons with sad stories are always the worst, eh? You want to sympathize with them, but then they're out here trying to kill everyone and singing sad songs. It's a whole mess. Doris had her mouth sewed shut by her mother to prevent evil spirits and voices from taking over, and eventually passed on, becoming one of these presences summoned by the board. Once she became a demon, Doris possessed many people. Anyone foolish enough to summon her using a board would be taken over and killed in horrific ways. Doris will make people hang from Christmas lights by their own doing, or put their heads through porcelain sinks. That's gotta hurt, and there's no coming back from that kind of head trauma. There's some swimming pool antics, some stitch-mouthed ghost antics, the whole 9 yards. Even though Doris was just a girl, as a demon she has a whole lot of anger and terror to express. And what better way to express your demonic urges than through a killing spree? Sounds like fun. So if you'd like to keep your bathroom pristine and your head unmunched, stay away from that Ouija board. Coming in at number 2, we've got Shush. This one comes from another supposedly true tale where average folks messed with a board and paid the price. Everyone knows how embarrassing it can be to be shushed, especially by a stranger. So what about a paranormal stranger? One with the potential to shut you up for good? It doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun if I'm being totally honest, but that's exactly what happened here. 2 friends decided to take a swing at some Ouija board antics and plopped one down on their table. They tried for a little while to contact any sort of presence, but came up short. After asking a few more questions, they returned to the top, asking questions like, "Is there anyone here that would like to communicate with us?" This apparently was the last straw, as the planchette immediately moved to no. Thinking this was their chance to finally talk with someone from the other side, they pushed further, asking more questions. But the presence did not appreciate this and used the planchette to spell out S-H-U-S-H. Shush. Holy moly, it just wanted some peace and quiet. After this, the room felt considerably colder, and the pals didn't want to see what would happen if they didn't follow the presence's instructions. Something tells me it wouldn't have been pleasant. I could see a demon stealing someone's voice, or permanently sealing their mouth for not being quiet when told. So who wants to play the quiet game? I'll start. Coming at number 1, we've got Zozo. Now, you know we couldn't do a Ouija demon list without including one of the newest and most prolific entries into the ghostly pop culture oeuvre. Zozo seemingly hasn't been around that long, and his popularity is largely attributed to internet culture gassing him up. There might be brief mentions of this demon in assorted old compendiums and grimoires, but nothing concrete, and the old writings don't really connect him to Ouija boards or possession either. But Zozo is a famous demon now, and those tend to do exactly what people expect them to do. The more we discuss him, the stronger and more bold he grows. Many who have encountered this demon feel its presence for years after the fact, regardless of whether they closed the session or not. One tale recounts a man almost seeing his drown in the bathtub, attacked by Zozo. Others say that the demon acts like a poltergeist, ruining their homes and injuring them frequently. If your planchette moves from Z to O to Z to O, yes, I am Canadian, say goodbye and throw it in a fire. Nothing good will come from any further interaction. Can you still buy Ouija boards at Toys R Us? Well, their bankruptcy might prove to be a bigger barrier than the actual availability of the board, but still. I've always wondered if spirits knew the difference between mass-produced boards and special ones. I suppose you could just make one on a sheet of paper and go from there, even on your wall, Stranger Things style.